got a selection of Royal Enfield Bullet bits and pieces in front of me here, and among them I've got two 350 cylinder barrels and two 500 cylinder barrels, all cast iron. There's no alloy ones here, and to the best of my knowledge these are all sort of unmolested and pretty much as they came from the factory. They've been used and maybe a chipped fin or something here and there, but I don't think anything else has been done with them. And the reason I'm making this video is I sort of accidentally and unwittingly made a discovery a few years back when I started tuning these engines, and I started shortening the cylinder barrels, often by anything up to about 2mm, which is a heck of a lot when you think that you can get head gaskets of 1mm thickness, or to increase your compression ratio you can use one of 0.5 mm thick. Well, just compare that with taking 2mm off the height of a cylinder barrel from gasket face to gasket face. And I've done it on both 350 and 500 versions, and I just gathered these bits and pieces up here, and I thought I'd just sort of demonstrate my findings really. We have here, this is a 500, an Indian 500 cylinder barrel cast iron, and I've got the vernier set up already to just sort of, it will actually go across the gasket faces. There we are, let's see, there we are, right, it's on across the gasket faces with the slightest room to wiggle perhaps. And I've already taken measurements, and I can tell you that gasket face to gasket face on that barrel is 77mm. Probably already seen the British one is 76. The British one is here next to it, and we're on the gasket faces there. Look at that wobbling around by comparison. That's because the gasket faces are a whole millimetre closer together on the British barrel than they are on the Indian one. Now I've seen differences even greater than that, but let's just stick with a millimetre. So the British cylinder barrel is a millimetre shorter than the Indian one. That goes a heck of a long way to increasing the compression ratio. Another way to sort of identify which is the British one and which is the Indian one, look how tidy, let's get them facing the same way as each other to be fair to them. Look how tidy the casting of the British one is, and how slim the edges of the cooling fins are compared to the Indian one, which is quite sort of thick at the edges of the fins. And also these marks down here following the line of the pushrod tunnels, where it looks as if almost like they've had high spots being hit flat with a hammer. Now there's very slight evidence of some markings on the British one, and obviously they're casting marks, but just compare the two and how tidy the British one looks compared to the Indian one. So that's a good giveaway. But if you happen to be in the market for one of these cylinder barrels and want to know if you're getting a British one, it will probably be 76mm tall from gasket face to gasket face. That's fairly easy to put the Indian one in the lathe and take a millimetre or two or whatever off, and I've done that, although I do prefer working with aluminium ones. It's a hell of a lot easier. I've had the odd cast iron one, I've had the cutter dig in, and sometimes the consequences aren't very nice. But anyway, there's a 500 barrels, and some differences between the two from a tuning point of view more than anything, as well as, what's the word, aesthetics. Obviously the British one looks prettier. We got a similar sort of story with the 350s, and I've got very old, this is one of mine actually, this was a stalled project, and I really must sort of get my finger out and look at the state of that, get that cleaned up and get on with it. But anyway, the reason for having that here again was I've got an Indian cylinder barrel there, 350 in front of me, and I'll just put the camera down for a moment, enjoy the view a sec. what I'm going to do is I'll just set the vernier up to measure gasket face to gasket face on the 350 barrel, the Indian one. There we are, we've got a nice, let's do that again, don't want to cheat anybody. Right, we've got a nice grippy sliding fit of the vernier on that one, and I measured it earlier, but let's just confirm it anyway. I'll use my magic magnifying glass, and that tells me that we're just a whisker, literally a whisker, under 70 millimeters. It's probably just a couple of thou under 70 millimeters actually. I've seen some Indian ones that have measured on the higher side of 70, sort of up to 71 even, but that one is just, and that's under 70. Now here's the old, very old, early incarnation of a British G2 350 engine. Look at the vernier wobbling around on that by comparison, and that is because that one measures 69.5 millimeters from gasket face to gasket face. So when you're tuning one of these engines or looking for a higher compression ratio, you've already got a head start if you've got a British cylinder barrel. If you've got an Indian one, you can of course shorten it, but as they came out the factory, you often hear of the Indian Enfields, the 350s and 500s being less powerful and less lively than their British counterparts, and there's many other sort of reasons why, like the porting in the cylinder head is not so good, and the valve timings have been altered, but a major player out of the box, if you like, is just that the Indian machines have very slightly taller cylinder barrels which knock back the compression ratios. So there's one area, and I'll be talking about others fairly soon.